So I feel that even though the University of Sydney is hosting today's event, you can't really talk about digital health or eHealth at Sydney without inviting somebody from Macquarie University. And who better to represent them than Professor Enrico Coeira. Enrico is the Director of the Centre for Health Informatics, Australian Institute of Health Innovation at Macquarie University. With a research background in industry and academia, he has a strong international research reputation for his work on decision support and communication processes in biomedicine. Please join me in welcoming Enrico.
Good afternoon. Are we having a post-lunch dip or are we up? Thank you. So thank you very much, Heiko, for the very generous invitation, and it's wonderful to see the level of interest at Sydney Uni. I was telling Heiko that when I graduated from medicine here in the early 80s, I thought, I'll go and see what these computers are about. Went to the computer science school here at Sydney Uni, and I said, look, I'm a doctor, and I'm really interested to know more about computers and what they might do in healthcare. And they said, oh, that's very interesting. We have no idea what to do with you. So I went to UNSW, and that was a separate story. But things have changed, and I'm really excited to see that. One of the themes, or the theme really for the keynotes today, has been the learning health system. And you cannot imagine realising this dream without some technology. One of the core technologies will be artificial intelligence, or AI, both as the learning part, learning from patterns using machine learning, but also in the enacting part through decision support systems. What I'm going to do in my very short 20 minutes is try and shine some light on the opportunities, but also where I think some very real challenges sit. It's a very fast-moving field. So just last week in one of the Lancet journals, we had our first double-blinded RCT of a deep learning enabled system. This one here was for colonoscopy and adenoma detection, and they had AI trying to detect the adenomas compared to sham. And the results were sufficiently interesting in terms of screening. You'd see an improvement here with this of 34%. And what the AI was doing, which is probably more interesting, was it was picking the very, very small or difficult to detect lesions that the humans were not. We'll talk more about that in a second. Also from last week, another event. This is the FDA in the US approving echocardiogram AI. This AI doesn't just interpret the echo, it tells you where to position the handheld device. So the point of this is to put echocardiography in the hands of people in the field with small devices. And I can see there are echo people in the room, they're going, oh my God, what's going to happen to my profession? This will be changing what happens, I'm sure, in the years to come as we get more point-of-care smart testing. But also imagine the impact of that sort of technology in a resource-poor setting where everybody now has a smartphone, you attach a transducer to it, and all of a sudden we have access to very high-quality care and diagnostics that perhaps otherwise would not be possible. So it's always almost a first-world lens we bring to AI. But I think its transformational capacity really, in some places, is far greater than what might happen here. So just to give you a sense of the speed of things, I haven't got the 2019 figures here, but these are the number of US FDA-approved AI in healthcare applications, and you can see the dramatic growth. 2019, I should go there and see what's happened, but it should be larger. And don't forget, behind each one of these is an awful lot of money, an awful lot of testing, and a commercial venture putting money into the technology because they think they can make money. And in terms of the research, I mentioned that was the first RCT that was double-blinded for deep learning. But in terms of AI more broadly, not just deep learning technologies, we've got many RCTs over the last 20 years showing benefit, not just in imaging, but diabetic retinopathy, head CTs, wrist fractures, but also in psychiatry, major depressive disorders, in terms of processes, things like medication adherence, CBT, etc., etc. So the technologies, whether they are good old-fashioned AI or more modern deep learning, we've shown can make a difference. And so the question really is much more around translation, I think. Now, because this might be the first time you've heard about it, I thought I would benchmark where today's AI is. And these results are about a year and a half out of date. So this is AI on standard tasks. And this is the what I would call the Where's Wally task. Can the AI pick a single object out of a complex image? The red line is baseline human performance, and you can see that AI is much better than humans at this task, which is why a lot of us get worried by automated facial recognition technology, for example. In terms of speech recognition, sort of Siri listening to you on your iPhone, you can see that at least for single speaker, AI is roughly equal to humans. When it comes to multiple speakers, it gets much more complicated. AI does stumble very significantly when you have multiple people speaking. Things get worse when AI needs to know something about the subject. So in the question answering sort of tasks, you might ask it, what is the capital of Germany, or who's the Prime Minister of England? Those are things that are easy to answer, but you can equally ask much more complicated questions. And the toughest sort of tasks are interpreting the meaning of images, what's actually going on in the picture. So it's not saying, is that a cat, but why is the cat sitting on the dog? That sort of complicated question. Now, to give you a sense of the limits of AI, I've really talked about tasks where the AI is recognising a pattern, whether it's an image or a voice. One of the challenges for AI is what we would call general purpose reasoning. In other words, being able to understand complex knowledge domains and then reason through what's going on. And this system, GPT-2, was released in the release I'm going to talk about late last year. It's a very big neural network. You can see 1.5 billion tunable parameters in this model. And the idea is that you give GPT-2 some text and it will then respond. If it's a question, it will answer, or if you provide it some sentences, it'll tell you what should follow on. And I thought it would be interesting to show you how GPT-2 works. So I gave it a prompt, which was, my father smoked heavily, so I grew up in a house filled with, and I was expecting the word smoke as the response. So let's see what it did. So it said, in a house filled with the odours of smoking. It would have been good if it stopped there, but no. There was no way I was going to miss out all the great things that smoking was doing for me. Okay, so you can see, sponsored by Dunhill, I guess. So the way this technology works is it's based on common phrases, what people talk about, common structures to phrases. It knows nothing about epidemiology and public health, nothing. So the idea of it as a general purpose AI is still quite a while away. Let me summarise. I could have shown you other ones. That was the least embarrassing. Today's AIs are trained to do single things like detect an adenoma in an image. They're not good at general purpose reasoning yet, and my own view is that so-called artificial general intelligence, or AGI, is at least 20 years away. We don't know how to do that. Nobody's got a clue how to build that system, but there could be a bright postdoc somewhere here or an MIT that is going to change all that. The other thing I want to talk to you about is just how quickly this has become a money game and has moved out of research. I guess because the UK needs to do well post-Brexit, they're investing an awful lot in AI. Matt Hancock, the health secretary there, invested last year about £250 million just in R&D, and there's actually another £1 billion invested in translating AI across the NHS. Huge investments, a bet on technology, and something that is happening at similar scale in other countries, but not all, and certainly not something that is currently on the agenda here. In terms of investor capital, there's a company in the UK called Babylon, which provides consumer-facing apps and help you engage with the NHS. It's now worth about $2 billion, which is huge for a small digital health company. It was the largest capital raise ever. Babylon is in the UK, it's trying to come to New Zealand, and it's now looking to come to Australia too. If you have shares in Alphabet, which owns Google, you might be worried that DeepMind, one of its companies, is losing about $500 million a year as it investigates AI. I just want to remind you that it has about $120 billion in cash, so they can do this for 200 years. So there's a real sense in which large-scale industry, Apple, Google, Amazon, are all able to invest in these technologies in a way that we in academia will never be able to do, which poses an interesting challenge for what it means to do research in AI. The title of my talk is about the last mile, and what I want to do with that is to get you to move away from thinking about the machine and to think about healthcare. And so I like to think about it going in three segments. The world of analytics is all about data capture, getting the data in good shape. Most of what I've talked to you about now is what I would call middle mile efforts, about making algorithms work and demonstrating in the lab or on bench that it does better than humans. Nobody really is much talking about what it means for healthcare and how it might change the practice for care. And my contention to you today is that is where we should be worrying. So just to give you an example, this is that company Babylon that I was talking to you about, and it did a trial in London. It owns a number of GP practices in London, and the front door to the practice is through their app, which has an AI-driven symptom checker. And in an evaluation, what was interesting was what happened. One was the people who came to the Babylon primary care were all young and well. Okay, you think that's fine. The consequence was every other practice around them that didn't rely on Babylon technology lost those patients and were dealing now with complex, more elderly patients. And since they were on a fixed budget, the normal GP practices are now in financial trouble because they're dealing with the hard cases on a fixed, capped system, as happens in the UK. The other thing that is a last mile issue is patient safety, and if you study patient safety, you know that no event is a single event. It's always an event that might involve technology and human error and bad luck, all kinds of things. And the problem a lot of us have with technologies like Babylon is that they're not really evaluated in the real world for patient safety. And in this paper, I think from about a year ago now in Lancet, I wrote with some co-authors, we looked at the published data from Babylon and showed really that there was no security that Babylon was actually performing better than doctors as they were claiming. We were concerned that in fact it was causing errors. So there's a big issue really about regulation in the real world, making sure these are safe systems. And it's part of what we call the digital health trade-off, not just for AI. Typically we're going to drop errors with better technology, but we're going to create iatrogenic harms, new classes of errors, and they're often tricky to detect. Now, going back to that comment I made at the very beginning about the adenoma detection, here's another paper. This one is on ultrasound again and detection for thyroid cancer. Very impressive results, really. The AI was much more specific, about 86% compared to humans, about 60% in detecting these, and about the same sensitivity. So really a fantastic thyroid cancer diagnosis system, except what are we detecting? We already have in some countries over-treatment and over-diagnosis of thyroid cancer. So by picking up small, potentially never progressing disease, we're probably going to be treating even more people unnecessarily than before. And those adenomas that have been picked up in the second slide that I gave you may well never turn into a carcinoma. So if you ever get the chance to hear Paul Glazier from Bonn talk about over-treatment and over-diagnosis, there's a real risk that focusing on middle mile performance, which is all about how good is the algorithm, ignores the impact of that on the care system and on patients. So a thing that worries many of us. The next thing I want to talk to you about is to think about not just the algorithm, but the algorithm plus the person. And I always show this slide and say, human plus technology, what could possibly go wrong when we rely on technology? And the truth is that we are very trusting of technology, and we are very trusting in healthcare of what the technology tells us, whether it's... no one's ever done this, have they? Hands up if you've done something similar. Some brave folks. It's probably 95%, I'm sure. So this is something we call automation bias, and we study it in healthcare for decision support systems. It's really when we over-rely on the technology and the technology is imperfect. Essentially, we put our trust in it because it's never done anything wrong before until the moment it tells us to do something we shouldn't do. So that paper there from 2016 was a systematic review where it showed automation bias really present in screening for breast cancer, for ECG interpretation across the board, both false positives and false negatives. We just tend to overtrust technology. And that's one of the challenges with screening and AI too. So automation bias is another last mile issue, which is the way we as people use the technology. So I would wrap up. For those of you who are interested in saying, I want a research career in this area, and ask you, where should you be focusing your attention? You could be focusing on this chip, and that's fine, building the technologies, building the algorithms, tweaking your machine learning architectures, but also worrying about issues about bias and ethics in the data sets. Most people are playing in that circle right now, so a lot of competition. Fewer people are looking at what's happening here, which is the human part of the equation. Remember, we're not talking about technology replacing people, we're talking about human plus machine pairings. People talk about the age of the centaur. They're talking about human machines as centaurs now. Not sure if I like that. But so what sort of training do you need to do to be a safe clinician to use these technologies? How do you deal with automation bias, etc.? And I think then the next area is to really look at the properties of making these systems safe, effective, and recognising that they're going to do things that are emergent. And if I was going to have one final panel, I would draw a panel around the room to include this, because there's another level, which is the health system. So it's not just about one clinician plus one AI. It's them working in a hospital or in a GP practice or engaging with a patient, and those engaging with others, and those engaging with their Facebook app or Instagram, engaging with another system which might be transport. You look at the way societies respond to outbreaks of infectious diseases, for example. You look at voting patterns from elections driven very much by AI-driven message on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. So we're building what I call a cognitive health system, which is a system that is going to behave in really weird ways. Just as a plug, there's a paper in Lancet this week on that I wrote. Have a look at that. So I think leave the machine to Amazon and Apple. Worry about how we use the technology, and be really interested in what happens to the health system. It's going to be interesting when we try and craft a learning health system that doesn't do what it's told, which is potentially one of the consequences of having embedded AI in it. So my last slide is to say, look, this is all very real. This is happening now. You're not going to see too much in the next 2 or 3 years, maybe. In 10 years' time, it will all be here and it'll be very real. And 10 years is not a long time if you're trying to reschool the training program of one of the colleges, or change your medical degree or your nursing degree. I think the talk of people losing their jobs is really misguided. I think the work we do will change, and the professions we have will change. So if you're a medical student today, you will be doing something different in 20 years to what you imagined. And for those of you who are mid-career, you probably have a couple of changes coming too. And I think just leave with that last example of the echocardiogram with the AI that allows you not just to interpret, but puts it in the hands of non-experts so they can even position it. That's where true disruption happens, when you get multiple things converging. So it's going to be very hard to predict where it all goes, but change is coming. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. You mentioned that we should leave the software building to Google and other companies. Is there a benefit to have kind of co-design with the patients and health professionals while we're designing the software as well?
So when I talk about software, I'm talking a bit more about the gubbins inside, the deep learning algorithms, etc. I think the shells around them, the things that we interact with, whether that's going to be an app or a Siri or an Alexa, are things that we do design. So that kind of service design part, that belongs to us with the help of maybe some of those companies. But really even the technologies for design now are much simpler than they were even 5 or 10 years ago. So separate algorithm construction and how to do deep learning from service delivery.
Thanks for clarifying that. I think I meant when you're building kind of the algorithm, you use a lot of data sets, and currently a lot of those data sets are health related and not always ethically sourced. So that's where I think sometimes having patient and health professional involvement might be useful.
I think you're right. Data governance is a very critical but separate issue, but actually very interestingly deeply embedded in some of the practices of the corporates and to the concern of many.
Yeah, hi Enrico, thanks for a great presentation. Many years ago we introduced Kaplan-Meier graphs into oncology to measure outcomes, and that enabled us to see whether interventions actually had a net effect. Most of the research in AI sort of looks at a single point. Is there any methodology around measuring the ultimate outcomes of this, so we actually have a proof that it's actually doing a difference rather than just a different way of getting to the same place?
I think, George, that's just now something we just do routinely. You've got the intervention, which is the AI wrapped in a service, wrapped in a culture, and then we try and measure outcomes. The challenge is most of the studies we see are quite short duration, and you don't see maybe outcome changes for many years, especially with some of the chronic diseases. So I think there's kind of an imbalance probably between the desire for a result early on, look how accurate my AI is, I can now sell it, versus here's the long hard graft of the RCT, which involves 20,000 people and runs for 2 years.
Thank you for the great presentation. One of the issues with AI, I suppose, is it's a black box when it's stated, and that's not always good in healthcare. What are your views, and how do you think we can solve that and make it more transparent to clinicians as well?
Thank you. That's a hot issue. Many people seem to talk about explainability a lot. The computer scientists of late are saying, I don't understand why you even bothered about explainability, because people do things without understanding how they work. How many people know how their phone works? They don't want it explained. That's one extreme view, and a lot of clinicians say, we don't trust technology, please give me your reasoning. My answer would be to say that explainability relates to the task at hand and the user. So if you're a very experienced clinician, who are 20 or 30 years into your career, you do not need to have a deep explanation. You just might need to be prompted or reminded. Whereas a much more junior clinician may well want that. So it's an it depends answer.
Terrific talk, Enrico. Thanks very much. I was struck by your comment about a learning health system using AI, doing something other than what it was told. Can you translate that poetic image into a scenario? Okay,
so one would be that we now have the Friedman TM learning health system, which is functioning beautifully and generating evidence very quickly about practices. And what's happening is that some of those practices that are great, of necessity, make other practices obsolete. But some of those obsolete practices might involve somebody's career or the skills they've got, and the unintended consequence might be that I have to stop doing this procedure because it's no longer evidence-based, and there's no give in the system to allow me the time to reskill and retool. So focusing just on identifying what's good needs to also consider the broader impact. Is an example of a perverse outcome maybe where you didn't expect to harm people's professions.
Could I ask a follow-up? Where I thought you were going with that
I'll take notes.
Was an algorithm, a deep learning algorithm earns the trust of a community, and they implement it, and then that algorithm begins to give some kind of clinical advice that runs counter to what the higher goals of the community are, and suddenly you're optimizing against a different criterion.
I think that's another great example.
Well, that also lines up with what you're saying.
And one final question on that side.
I just want to follow up on your comment before about data governance. it seems to me that if we're going to have this sort of surge of AI applications coming into our health system, that we really need to start thinking about the standards and the way we analyse or assess data governance now, and start thinking about getting some different, looking into our crystal ball and thinking about how we're going to govern data and what really matters. And I'm in the biospecimen biobanking world, and we collect biospecimens because they contain the data that we use through our molecular omics and all this sort of stuff. So we need to start thinking about how we manage that as well, and that goes right back down to the patient that we get these samples from and so on. So you can see that there's a bit of a ripple effect, that if we're going to throw the pebble of the AI into the pond, it's going to have a ripple effect through all these governance and ethics issues. I was wondering whether you want to make a comment about what we need to start thinking about doing now with those sorts of things to enable AI, which is going to happen in due course.
Yeah, I would say we're already on the back foot because it's already here. So the NHS, has been selling NHS clinical data to large US companies, not necessarily with the permission of patients in the NHS. People are don't believe they consented to this particular use of their data. And so algorithms are being built by companies like DeepMind, etc., using data that people have problems with them having. And we already have circumstances. There are companies already operating in Australia. There's one that does GP booking that was using people's data in a different way. So I think those data governance issues aren't something we think about. I think we have the problem now and we're not ready. So I think putting energy and effort into that and resource is probably critical.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Enrico.